All right, folks, so we are on to our fourth and final mini lecture of week 1 in Geography 4880. I know previously I had said we'd probably do about 5 of these mini lectures. This week we're going to just bunch them into 4. I apologize for the miscommunication. We're going to pick up where we left off in the third one, which was discussing approaches to contemporary geography, in particular the different philosophies of science within contemporary geography, meaning the ways in which contemporary geographers observe the world. They have different theories or philosophies or paradigms about how we properly can observe the world around us and make sense of it and understand how it works. Okay, so previously we had looked at positivism and empiricism, a main thread running throughout much of physical geography today, in which observation is seen as fundamental, first-hand observation in particular. We can see everything we need to around us, and we can make measurements of, say, river systems that help us build up facts that ultimately lead us to theories about how the world works, how river systems work. What we're going to look at today, or in this mini lecture, is a different approach called structuralism, and ultimately another approach called post-structuralism. And these two actually take a different tack. Whereas positivism says everything we need to know about the world can be immediately firsthand observed. Okay, that's the empiricism dimension of positivism. Whereas that's the case, in structuralism and indeed in post-structuralism, there is much more skepticism about our ability to see the important things of our world, to experience them firsthand. And skepticism about that firsthand observation as the basis for all knowledge. Okay, so structuralism, we'll start here, is skeptical that firsthand observation can provide us a sufficient basis for all the knowledge we need about how the world works, simply put. Instead, structuralism says society, culture, and individual behavior, so it is more focused on social science type of questions. Those things must be understood and described in terms of larger overarching systems and institutions or structures that cannot be directly observed. Things like language, economy, government, education. In short, as an example, we might be able to, using a positivist and empiricist kind of approach, go out and observe all sorts of economic transactions, people buying and selling things. We could measure that, okay? And we could share those facts with the rest of the world and say, that's it. This is how the world works. GDP is $1 trillion this year or whatever. Structuralism says, well, that's insufficient. Okay, that might be true. Okay, but it is not enough for us to really understand how the world works. Okay, and in particular, how economies work and how power is manifest in economies. In other words, think about capitalism. Okay, capitalism is not something that we can necessarily feel or see or otherwise experience firsthand. Okay, we can't go out and necessarily measure capitalism in the way that empiricists and positivists might prefer us to. Okay, instead, capitalism is a structure, okay, that we can't measure directly, according to structuralism, but that nonetheless really shapes, as an overarching system and set of institutions, really shapes how the world works. Okay. As another example, we could think about all sorts of important key categories that social scientists have come up with, like race, gender, class, okay? These are all things that we could take a positivist and empiricist approach to. We could go out and try to measure and witness firsthand gender, but in many ways, those concepts are things that we cannot directly observe. We cannot directly observe class. Instead, class is something that can't be directly observed, consists of power relations that we have to get at, understand in different ways, using different methods, okay? So let's dive into this. Structuralists attempt to unearth the deep empirically elusive forces that guide human actions in the transformation of human physical landscapes, okay? Empirically elusive, that means they're not necessarily easy to measure and observe things. Or to more properly put it, they're not necessarily easy things to directly or firsthand measure, okay, and observe. There are things that we can certainly go out and study, but we don't necessarily experience them in the sort of firsthand way that positivists might suggest. Structuralists are also interested in understanding our agency in relation to these forces, okay? So if the world is comprised of these structures like capitalism, racism, settler colonialism that influence what we do and what society looks like and how it operates, then what sort of agency do we as individuals have in relation to these structures, okay? Structuralists believe that empirical observations cannot capture the essence of processes and causes because they ignore the power relations in which visible spatial relationships are embedded, okay? We might be able to, visibly see capitalism play out on the landscape, or visibly see an economic system play out in the landscape in terms of, urban development and, how land cover changes and whatever, taking a positivist approach. We could document that, okay, because we can observe that firsthand. But all we've done is kind of document or describe that. Okay, we haven't actually captured the processes driving urban change or the causes of urban change. And structuralists would say, well, that's the important thing. And we have to do that by thinking about power, which is not something that we can observe firsthand. We cannot observe social power and how people are able to compel each other to do certain things. We can't observe that firsthand. Remember, previously we had said positivism is, tends to be focused in on, collecting facts that then maybe we can correlate with other facts and, kind of describe outcomes. We can collect facts about land loss, collect facts about what sea level rise has been, and maybe put the two together to posit climate change is driving sea level rise, or sea level rise is causing land loss. But it doesn't actually, those are just correlations, and we're not able to really get at causes through that approach. So structuralists come in and say, well, oftentimes we do want to understand the causes, and so we have to take a different approach to get at those causes. And how do we do that? On a real sort of logistical or practical basis? Well, in social research, we have different methods that could be broadly lumped into extensive strategies and intensive strategies. These are all strategies for getting around the fact that firsthand observation alone doesn't lead us to those important processes and causes that illustrate structures like capitalism, racism, settler colonialism, etc. So we'll dig into each of these with some examples, but generally, extensive research strategies rely on a large number of individuals to understand what's going on, but few properties to describe them. So just a quick example is we might do a survey of 1,000 Canadian households to understand, their income and their beliefs about COVID vaccinations. And that might tell us a bit about whether rich people are more or less likely to, reject vaccinations, let's say. Intensive research strategies, on the other hand, take a smaller group of individuals, maybe 30 people, but a large number of properties, where they work, their opinions, their detailed opinions about something, maybe some income, gender, race, et cetera, information in order to describe them. So an example, we might interview 30 people to get their detailed opinions about vaccinations. And that might help us understand why people reject vaccinations, a little bit about, what leads them to reject vaccinations, so on and so forth. Ron Johnson here draws out this key distinction. So let's elaborate it on a little bit more. So extensive strategies are really identifying common outcomes through large-scale studies. And in those large-scale studies, the key thing is that we cancel out sort of the idiosyncratic behavior of individuals. We're all different, but when we get enough of us together in a study, we really cancel out those differences, and we can see patterns across an aggregate whole in terms of very basic categories like race, gender, class, so on. Intensive research, on the other hand, says that idiosyncrasy is actually important, and it shows us that it actually helps us reveal some of those structures that we're trying to get at and describe. Idiosyncrasy, the fact that, I work, just an example, made up example, I work at a big capitalist company, I sell, stocks and bonds or whatever, but I, maybe think that the rich should be taxed more, or we need to do more about climate change. That sort of disjuncture helps us, doing interviews that helps us see those sorts of things, helps us get at the complex interaction of necessary relations with contingent conditions, which is a mouthful, but basically means the interaction between what is sort of fundamental to structures, the fact that capitalism, say, needs to reproduce itself through increasing profit in a way that is destructive to labor and environment, okay, with contingent conditions, the fact that individuals in capitalism, may not always subscribe to that philosophy, or may not always facilitate that increase of profit and the fulfillment of the profit motive at the heart of capitalism. So doing that kind of intensive research can help us tease out, well, okay, to what extent does capitalism need those individuals to reproduce the profit motive, and how exactly do they reproduce this structure, capitalism? Okay, and we could apply that to race, gender, settler colonialism, so on and so forth. Andrew Sayre, another geographer, and Ron Johnson is also a geographer, just to make that clear, that we are focusing really on geographers here. He puts it very similarly. So extensive research does tend to be a bit more empirical, so survey research, a bit more concrete, again, large samples. It demonstrates variabilities and the degree to which specific, sorry for the misspelling, cases are representative. Okay, so think again of just representative samples here. Whereas intensive research it's going to be a bit more abstract, theoretical, have smaller samples, but it's good at illustrating the underlying causal mechanisms generating patterns. Okay, so again, to go back to the example of vaccination research, we could survey people to see whether they're vaccinated, kind of line that up with income or race or gender or whatever. But that doesn't necessarily help us describe why it is that maybe rich people are less vaccinated. Well, if we interview them, we might understand a bit more about the mechanisms by which rich people tend to be less vaccinated. And I'm just making that up. I don't know if that's true, just an example. Let's look at a more clear example here, researching the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap describes the fact that for the exact same work, women tend to be paid less than men. This is true in Ontario, Canada, North America, if not the Western world as a whole. So what are the significant structural contributors to the existence of this pay gap between genders in Ontario? What are the things that we can't see or witness firsthand, but then nonetheless matter to the fact that this phenomenon exists? So we might come up with some research questions or research objectives to help us get at this. And this would be an example of an extensive approach. We could find 3 professions with the largest gaps. You know, maybe it's software development, fast food worker, and administrative assistant, just totally throwing out 3 examples there. Maybe those are the largest gaps between men and women when it comes to the same work. We could survey a sample of women in each profession, you know, and just look at relevant variables, whether maybe it's, you know, white women are actually paid as much as men, but maybe minority women are not actually, you know, maybe they experience the gender pay gap more. And so maybe that leads us to the conclusion that the significant structural contribution is racism to the gender pay gap. So, you know, we would do that by testing for statistically significant relationships between those attributes, those large number of attributes, or, you know, a few number of attributes that we're getting out of each survey respondent. So that could be some useful research. Taking an intensive approach, our research question could change, okay? We would probably be focusing more on a specific area because we cannot intensively talk to every woman in Ontario. So we might focus in on software development, and in particular in Kitchener-Waterloo. And, you know, we could talk about treatment in particular, not just pay, but how women might be treated differently than men in these jobs. Because, again, we're focusing more intensively on a select group of people. We're still interested in structural, you know, factors here, but we're focusing in intensively on just a handful of people so we can get more detail out of them. So our objectives here, you know, determine differential treatment and opportunities for women in these software development firms, why it happens, and how it might be addressed by government policy. These are objectives that are not going to be fulfilled by doing surveys necessarily, but, you know, intensive research relying on interviews, and focus groups, and so on might lead, you know, would probably more helpfully lead us to answers to these kinds of questions. So that is a structuralist approach to observing the world, and indeed documenting and changing the world around us, where the idea is we cannot directly see so many of the things that shape our world, like the structures behind capitalism, racism, settler colonialism. We can't empirically see those. And so we need other ways to get at them, okay? We need to take an extensive and intensive approaches to understanding processes by which the world is shaped around us, leading to gender pay gaps, leading to differences in vaccination rates, so on and so forth. Now, this final approach to contemporary geography, and these are all things we will cover in much more detail in the coming weeks, but this final approach, postmodernism and post-structuralism, they are somewhat separate. We'll see that in, I believe, week 4 or 5. But generally, the idea here is that post-structuralists go beyond structuralism to say that, you know, they agree that it's, well, they disagree with structuralists. They don't believe that it's actually possible to identify these deep generative structures like capitalism and settler colonialism and racism beneath the infinite variety of the surface of life. So they are much more dubious that there is something that we can't see out there, but that nonetheless shapes our world, okay? That there's no big entity out there that we should identify as capitalism or indeed, settler colonialism that structures everything that happens to us as individuals and structures in a deterministic way society. Instead, post-structuralists again say a whole different kind of observation is needed, one that recognizes the fact that researchers themselves bring all sorts of biases to observation. Post-structuralists say observations are dependent on the observer's relative position. Upper-class white men are going to see something, from that position, they're going to see and categorize the social world differently than someone who has, for instance, experienced capitalism firsthand in terms of being impoverished or having to work a menial labor job sort of situation. Okay, so post-structuralists say, where we come from into our research actually matters to what we see. Okay, and it matters to what kind of categories we come up with to describe the world. And indeed, many of our categories, like nature, society, capitalism, they are more historical artifacts, social constructions, rather than matters of fact. Okay, what we call nature has changed over time. And the fact that we've opposed nature and society as a kind of dualism or binary is the product of history, rather than some actually true way of understanding the world. Okay, this is something that postmodernists and post-structuralists try to make us see and understand, that actually so much of how we observe the world has to be a bit more self-reflexive. Okay, just as an example of this, and we will actually see this much more clearly in week 4 or 5. But post-structuralists might look to, and postmodernists might look to landscape or art on landscape as their means of observation, to try to understand how is it that society has characterized the world around us. And this is some of Emily Carr's work, one of the group of 7 artists. And post-structuralists, postmodernists would use this as evidence to talk about how society has, as revealed through art, how society has imposed categories like indigenous and underdeveloped and natural, and to understand the world around us and to critique some of these understandings, right? So we will get into that in week 4 or 5, but let's sum it up really quickly, just looking at how these 3 different approaches, predominant in contemporary geographic thought, might see something like climate change, or might research something like climate change. Well, positivism, or a more positivist empirical approach might say, look at identifying ecological relationships, testing whether those relationships are perturbed by change, by warming temperatures, by increased precipitation, by sea level rise. Okay, they might go out and measure, again, measure forests, measure the growth of trees in that forest, and correlate that with other measurements that can be made firsthand, like temperature, to try to come up with those correlations and ultimately develop a theory about the relationship between the two. Structuralists say, well, we need to be looking at the structures that shape how climate change is unfolding in responses to it. So a structuralist might try to get at some of the structures shaping how people move in response to climate disasters. How is it that some people are able to migrate after climate disasters and not others? Whereas a post-structuralist approach might look at the discursive constructions of risk and blame that climate activists and deniers make. So how do these different groups of people talk about the risks of climate change? So each of these takes a different kind of research question and answers it in a different way based on making different observations of the world. And we can see this in actual research. There's some more examples on here, along with some of the faces of real world geographers looking into these sorts of things. Okay, and we can certainly get into this in coming weeks. I think we'll see this example again, but we are at a time. Thank you for following along with this first set of lectures. I apologize they've gone a little bit longer, but it's important that we have this big overview to set us up well for the coming weeks. Take care.